So the M1 Macs have been out for a few months, and I didn't give an initial review because my initial impressions, there are a lot of people that give initial impressions and the specs are readily available. I wanted my review to be very much a thorough review about the M1 Mac for developers. I think that as I review hardware, I really want to look at it as the practical side of how it is to use for developers. So if you're talking about your single bird computer like a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino or things like this, how do they solve my problems? Do they solve my problems? And how good are they at it compared to the other things? So in this review, I don't have a direct M1 competitor for the Mac Mini because I don't have another mini computer like that. But I do have another computer that has a mobile processor in it, and that's my laptop. So for this comparison, we will be using my Lenovo laptop as a comparison. It has a 9th Gen i9 in it that we will be using to compare to the M1 Mac. Now, I wish I had a 11th Gen i9 in there. And if you'd like me to start getting some more of this hardware closer to when it's released, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and maybe I'll be able to get us a little bit more hardware because I'm still waiting on my 30 series GPU and I still haven't been able to get one. We're going to have three major categories. Now, I haven't used Mac OS since 2016, where they made that weird Mac with the strip bar at the top, and it completely ruined Macs for me. So I haven't used a Mac since then, so I am keeping anything I have about the OS itself as not a part of this review. This review is how well I could use an M1 Mac, trying to focus more on processor. All right, so it has three categories. The very first one is the tooling and ecosystem. Does it have the ecosystem I need as a developer to not be a hindrance? Does it have all the tools I need to do my job? The second one is it configurable enough to meet my needs? And now I look at several different angles with this. I not only look at hardware configuration, I look somewhat into OS configuration, as well as the ability to configure my tools. And the very third one, we're going to check its performance from a developer's perspective. I really don't like synthetic code tests because they really are geared towards testing a certain piece of hardware. So what I wanted to see was, how does it do compiling code? How does it do running code? How does it do doing these things I do on a daily basis? Is it going to be faster doing these things? Because that's really what matters to me. You can throw whatever benchmarks you want, but at the end of the day, those are just benchmarks. I want to see how it's going to feel as a developer. All right, so all of those should be time boxed below so you can skip to a part that you're most interested in. But if you don't mind, please watch this entire video. I worked very hard at it. Let's talk about tooling. Now I'm going to bring my laptop in to go over this list really quickly for you guys. This is the tooling that I tested. It is the tooling that I use most of the time. And I think that it covers a wide enough gambit of technology to make you feel comfortable that it probably supports the tooling you need. So I tested Go, Rust, Python, C++, JavaScript as languages. All of these languages work just fine after the 1.16 Go update. All of these languages worked fine, was able to compile and run just about any application. In Go, I built the Terraform project as well as some other larger projects. The one caveat I have to say with Go is that a lot of Go projects use other build tools. So if your thing uses something like Bazel, this might start to be a little bit more difficult, but all of these things are adding M1 support quickly. So I don't think it will be too long until you can use some of these other build tools. Rust, the entire ecosystem worked just fine, built several large Rust crates, and really had no problem. As far as cloud technologies go, I tested Terraform as well as the major three cloud CLIs. So you're talking about your Azure CLI, AWS, and GCP CLIs, and had no problems with any of them. On top of this, I did test a few other things related to the cloud, like command line tools like K9s, as well as Terraform. With package management, I used Homebrew before and after it got official M1 support, and this worked just fine. I was able to do everything I needed with Homebrew. That being said, the Homebrew for the M1 Max has a more limited selection of tools, but it had everything I needed. Mostly, the only thing that I needed from Homebrew was there. As far as code editors go, the only ones that I tested were the Visual Studio Code as well as Vim, because these are the only ones that I actually use. Visual Studio Code for the M1 Max worked perfectly fine with no problems at all and was quite snappy. I actually quite enjoyed using Visual Studio Code on the M1 Mac. And this is where all of my good news starts to go away. Virtual machines, I actually only got one type of virtual machine working. All the other virtual machines I never got to actually run. And yes, I was trying to run ARM versions, mostly just ARM versions of Ubuntu and Leap. The one virtual machine that I did get working happened to be Docker. So Docker runs a virtual machine, and Docker actually worked surprisingly well, much better than Docker for Windows. I guess that should be a surprise. It worked really well, and I actually really enjoyed using Docker on the M1 Mac. Not only was it snappy, it also supported a single node Kubernetes cluster. So it was kind of an all-in-one package for me since my other tools might not actually work on it. I never needed Minikube because Docker just brought it all. Now, that would bring me to the ecosystem of Kubernetes. It was a little lacking on M1 support. So if you're a big Kubernetes developer, and I mean developing on the Kubernetes project itself, not using Kubernetes, this was a little more lacking, but don't worry, all the tools I tested work fine on Rosetta 2. They're a little slow, but it's fine. If you're using kubectl backed by Rosetta 2, it doesn't really matter. I didn't expect to have problems with this, but this was a tool that I ended up having more problems with than I expected, and this was the Bluetooth. Now, I saw other YouTubers complain a little bit about the Bluetooth, but I didn't realize how bad the problem was. The Bluetooth on the Mac Mini M1 is almost unusable. They keep saying that they're going to come out with a fix for it, but I'm almost worried that it is a design flaw in the chip because it's taken so long for them to come out with a fix. I think Bluetooth is really important, especially to a Mac, because they already have few enough ports. Apple has repeatedly removed ports from their machines, and because of this, things like the Apple keyboard and the Apple mouse that I have, it's important that they work wirelessly. It's the reason I got these devices for the M1 Mac was to give me all the other ports I needed because, quite frankly, it has too few ports. I would like to have a wired mouse. The mouse is so bad on this device that it disconnects, and every once in a while I'll have to replug it in just to get it to reconnect to Bluetooth. Same with the keyboard. And my Sony wireless headphones desynchronize audio and visual. So if you tried to watch a movie like I did, you can't, because the audio is so far off of what you're actually seeing, so far behind. And I tried my wife's headphones and had the same experience. This was not a isolated case. And if you plugged in a USB headphone, you had no problem. So the Mac's Bluetooth is really quite bad. Before this, I would have told you that the Linux stack had by far the worst Bluetooth stack because it's notorious for problems. But the M1 Mac has now taken this crown from Linux. It has the worst Bluetooth experience on this side. I don't know what this side of, but this side of the moon. That doesn't even make sense. All right. It has the worst Bluetooth experience, and if you're big onto using Bluetooth, especially with a device that has very few ports, this is a big deal. I was able to use the Bluetooth to listen to music on the headphones, but in the end, I just connected my headphones to my phone because it was a better experience. All right, so in the end, it has pretty much all the tools that you could use as a developer. Now, I think that there are some caveats to stating this. If you develop and support a tool that runs on AMD 64, there is no way to get an AMD 64 VM, and there probably will never be the technology to emulate that. They could, but I doubt they actually do it. Rosetta 2 in itself is a fairly good AMD 64 emulator that you could build VMs on if Apple wanted you to, but I don't think they do, so you probably won't. So moving on with this, for me, this is kind of a bummer. I would always test our products on both AMD 64 and ARM 64 because in KVM, I could spin up both types of instances on AMD 64 architecture. And because of this, it allowed me to test in multiple configurations on a single machine, and this was really empowering my workflow. Now, if your workflow in Azure or AWS runs on AMD 64, I highly suggest that you keep a AMD 64 machine as your dev box so that it closely resembles where it's running. I always find this helpful because you run into weird hiccups. The other problem with the tools, besides Bluetooth, is that sometimes you just have to take a few extra steps, but this is being cleared up as we speak, and everything is getting easier. So I really don't see that as a problem. If you do your standard develop, if you do a standard Go or Rust web app or a microservice, you'll have no problem doing these same things on a M1 Mac if you've been doing them. I used Xcode as well, and Xcode worked just fine, thankfully. So I really don't think you'll have any problem with the M1 Mac from the tool's perspective, unless if you're a heavy VM user or have a lot of workloads that run in AMD 64, or your app is supported on AMD 64, because it will become impossible to debug. So now let's talk about configurability. And honestly, this is where the M1 Mac is a no-go for me. Up to this point, I am actually been kind of sold. And as you'll see from my performance perspective, I think that is a fantastic bang for buck. But the configurability of the M1 Mac is probably its largest downfall. Now, it's also the reason it's so fast. So the way that they were able to build such an efficient and fast thing was to solder everything together. The M1 Mac is the monolith of hardware. There is no modularity, there is no microservices. If you want more memory, you buy a new Mac. If you want a bigger hard drive, you buy a new Mac. If you want to replace your mouse, you buy a new Mac. Actually, the mouse is the one thing that you can replace on this thing, the mouse and keyboard. Everything else is soldered to the exact same board with no upgradability. But beyond that, even what you can get as far as configurability from the store is very low. So here are my recommendations from playing around with this. You cannot say, well, I'm going to get 8 gigs of memory now, and I'll get 16 later. If you want 16 later, you have to get 16 now. The other thing is, because everything is made to share the same memory, 16 gigs of memory is not nearly the same as 16 gigs of memory in a laptop like this. And the reason is this P1 from Lenovo has a dedicated graphics card. And that means the graphics don't actually touch the CPU's memory. Now, this actually does not make it quite as fast with everything sharing, but it also means that not only do I have 64 gigs of memory for the CPU, I also have a GPU that has 8 gigs of its own memory. All right, everyone. This is Future Merrick. I already had this video uploaded and it was ready to publish, and I had to take it down, and I'm just adding this short clip. So the reason I say that is I noticed something, and I needed to get this word out there because I don't think anybody else has said anything about this in the M1 Max. Everything in my original review that you're watching still holds true, but this one thing has made it where I cannot recommend anyone buy an M1 or M2 Mac until it's verified this is fixed. The problem is every application consumes almost 75% more memory when running on an M1 Mac. This goes for every application that I could find having a sister application on Windows. And if you find a sister application on Linux, it is almost double the amount of memory. So Visual Studio Code, which has a native application, requires double the amount of memory to run on the M1 Mac than it does on Linux. Now, this might be just the applications, I don't know. And so I will release a follow-up video in the future on this subject. But what I wanted to let you know is that some of this is quite staggering. And if you're going to get an M1 Mac, you need to buy double the memory that you normally would. So if you're going for 32 gigs, you need 64 gigs of memory. And that's just how it's going to be. On Windows, if you're using WSL2 to run Docker, it takes about 1.5 gigs total. If you are on the Mac, it takes almost 9 gigs total. It's like 8.75 gigs of memory just to run Docker. You want to run Dockers with Kubernetes on it, you're talking about almost 10 gigs at 9.75 gigabytes of memory just to run Docker or Kubernetes. This is not running your workload. This is not running any other application running your. Now, I believe this might have to do with that the GPU is sharing the memory, but this is actually a huge problem because I'm being serious. You need more memory. So one of my workflows that I've done on my Windows PC with the old i7 is when I'm editing one of these videos, I have Premiere Pro and After Effects open. After Effects, I'm making the crappy graphics that I make, and Premiere, I'm editing the video together. I couldn't do this on the M1 Mac because it took over 20 gigs of memory to have both open. Whereas on the Mac, this takes well under 10 gigabytes of memory for those two applications. I don't know why, but it almost feels exponential. If you open the application with nothing loaded, it takes almost double the memory. But then if you start loading video clips into Premiere Pro, it's almost exponential with how much memory it consumes. Now, maybe these are the apps, and maybe they will get better. But at the time being, I did not find one app that ran close to remotely with the same amount of memory. Now, this isn't a ton of apps because I had to find apps that were on both machines. And I'm going to be doing more testing on this subject in the future. I just needed to let you guys know right now, I cannot recommend anyone use the Apple ARM architecture, because if this is a problem with the chips, it means it's not going away. And these machines are almost useless, at least to me. I would require 128 gigs of memory. I can't imagine, that Apple is going to support that large of a memory bank, but not only that, it gets much more expensive. This 16 gig ARM PC that I thought was a good deal is really only equivalent of an 8 gig memory in an Intel machine. I don't know if I have done something wrong, and so I will follow up with this, but I have done about an extra day of testing to try to validate that I'm not doing something weird. And as far as I can see, this holds true that almost every application requires double the memory, and these are native applications. I also tested with Rosetta 2 just to see if Premiere Pro running in Rosetta 2 ran better, and it consumed a little bit more memory. So it's actually even worse, which would be kind of expected for the whole Rosetta thing. That being said, I honestly don't know how it consumes more memory, because memory should be dictated by the application and it allocating it. But for some reason it does, and for some reason it is. So anyways, back to the rest of the video. The whole rest of the video still holds true, and this doesn't invalidate any of those points. This was just an extra thing that I had not really thought to test because I was focused too much on the processor and how it affected my DevOps and its architecture, and not the whole system. So anyways, yeah, let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know if there's any test you'd like to run to see if I can't figure out this memory problem. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, the M1 Mac runs out of memory easier than I thought it was going to. 16 gigs of memory actually wasn't enough for me to do some of the things that I wanted to do. And I found it possible to run out of memory, especially because if you think about having a Chrome tab open, and if it's displaying any type of graphics, even if it's using the GPU is using the CPU's memory as well. This is not something a lot of people talk about, but I also found it in compiling. It just uses more memory than I would have expected it to use for doing the things that it does. Now, 16 gigs is probably fine for your standard use case, but if you find yourself running a lot of VMs or a lot of memory intensive things, the 16 gigs is probably not enough. Now, Macs, which are notoriously bad at configurability and expandability, have gotten even a step further. And for me, the performance that it gave wasn't good enough to give up these things. I love my 64 gigs of memory. I run like 12 VMs at a time and run an entire Kubernetes with ingress and everything in VMs like a real bare metal scenario. So I can demo out really complex scenarios using a single PC. You cannot do that on the M1 Mac at this time. And hopefully with the M2 you can do this, but just remember you need to buy it at the beginning. So if you ever want 64 gigs and the M2 Macs support 64 gigs, you need to buy it at the very beginning because there is no upgrade path for you down the road. Now there's other configurability options that I found quite lacking as well. This Mac doesn't come with anything like Boot Camp that will support Linux. So there was and is no way for me to run Linux. This was one of the most disheartening things. I surely hope that they support it in the future, because this would be the best mini server bang for the buck, hands down. Performance per watt usage. So a high performance, low watt usage machine that I could run headless with something like a Cubic server running on it, or maybe Ubuntu server. So instead of doing synthetic benchmarks, I wanted to do what I do as a programmer and see how that does. Now, because of how Docker works, I really wanted to I made this little program that actually sees how fast and benchmarks container runtimes. It's called CosSpec. But I made this and it works well on Linux, but it doesn't actually work on the M1 Mac because its maintainer couldn't really make it work well and do the same thing on an M1 Mac, because it's there to measure container runtimes, but the container runtimes actually run in a VM on a Mac. So there is no real way to do that except for just measuring them in the Linux container, but that is owned by Docker. So for the time being, I wasn't able to do that, but I can tell you that using Docker, using Visual Studio Code was snappy, was fast, and I never had an issue. I never really had it lag. and I loved it. Compiling code went quickly, just as fast as my desktop or my laptop. Now, this is where I have to say, from a user standpoint, I didn't notice anything from a feeling versus my desktop and my laptop. It was only when pushing was I able to start spotting differences, and that's where we'll talk about it. But even those differences, I want to be clear, are not much. If you're talking about a build time that takes you 1 minute versus 55 seconds, it's really not that big of a deal, and you probably won't see it. And if your build times are an entire minute, you probably try to avoid doing that as often as possible. So what I did, the other thing that I did, other than just building some projects where I built both Firefox on the i9 and the i7 and the M1 Mac, I also went to the computer language benchmarking game, which is a fun little thing where they try to benchmark languages against each other, and they build algorithms to see which language handles what type of algorithm better. But instead of using this to benchmark the languages against each other, I actually used it to benchmark computers against each other. So I picked several fun algorithms from there, and I ran Python, I ran Rust, and I ran Go. All I can say is that the architecture didn't really make a difference. If it ran slow in Python, it ran about the same slowness comparatively to the other ones on all the machines. So because I was interested to see if a certain language maybe benefited from the architecture, but that did not appear to be the case. Now, what I did was I ran these and I benchmarked them. I took the time that it took to complete. And really, honestly, unless if you push them to extremes, the i9 and the Mac were about the same. If you use more than 16 gigs, so if you do a highly parallelized thing that stores a lot of things in memory, the M1 Mac then suffers. If I'm able to explode that 15 or 16 gigabytes of memory, my laptop blew it away. And this was just because of file paging on the OS. So this is kind of to be expected and not really a problem with the M1 Mac. It was just a limitation of its configurability. I built Firefox across both and measured the amount of time it took to build this. I also built Chromium. Chromium was not a good one though, because some of the stuff had to run in Rosetta 2. And when it runs in Rosetta 2, the i9 surely wins, even a 1.5-year-old i9. Now, that being said, even if it's in Rosetta 2, it's not slow. I'm not saying that. I was really impressed with the M1 Mac's performance for being an ARM processor. And really, this is what makes me sad. In the end, I would love to be running a Ubuntu server on this machine and put it in the closet. I would be probably my next Raspberry Pi cluster would have been an M1 cluster. That's highly available. But as it stands, I cannot do this. And this is probably the biggest sadness that I have with this piece of hardware, is the fact that I can't. Now, I don't expect anything different from Apple, and I expect that if you use Apple, you understand Apple's hatred towards open source in general. This is another reason I personally don't use Apple itself. All right, so what are my final thoughts? Well, if you like working on a Mac and the Mac ecosystem is for you, I think you should have no problem with an M1 or hopefully later on an M2 Mac, especially if the VM and configurability options aren't a real problem for you, as well as if you don't want to run Linux. If these things aren't for you, I think that you will pick this up, you'll save yourself some electricity, and you'll be very happy. If these other things are important to you, if you want to run Linux, if you want to upgrade your machine later on, if these things are important to you, then maybe the M1 Mac isn't for you. Otherwise, I think it's a great piece of hardware, and really I'm looking forward to when I don't care about the warranty anymore and I try to install Linux on this thing, because this is where I think this is going to really shine. It's going to be a high performance, low power usage server as soon as I can get Linux installed on it. So if you like this review, I have a big ask for you. please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It would do me a lot of good. I am actually trying to get more things on this channel for you guys. And quite honestly, subscribing to this channel would be a huge help in me securing some more hardware and doing some more of these tests and reviews based off of actually using the things, not synthetic benchmarks. So if you'd like to see more reviews and more in-depth reviews on pieces of hardware, please like and subscribe to this video. Well, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and please tell your friends about the channel and get the word out so that I can help more people. That being said, if you watch this entire 20-minute something video and you're still grumpy and you still don't like this video, you love Macs and hate that I had anything bad to say about this piece of hardware, I need you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button, stick around, and see if these videos get any better for science. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and take a bite out of this apple. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. That was a horrible dad joke. It's a good apple though.